week 48, and we're on day 1. This week we're going to continue in the correspondence between Paul and the church in Corinth. Now, the church in Corinth, mostly made up of believers who came from pagan backgrounds, is facing a lot of difficulty and division. And in the first letter to the Corinthians, and today we're going to be looking at chapters 9 through 11, Paul continues to respond to questions that they have that have been brought to his attention. Now, there's a bit of tension between Paul and some of this congregation because, like any people, they want to know that they are in the right and everybody else is in the wrong. And sometimes Paul has to point out to those who are the best meaning and the most intentional that maybe they're not going quite the right way. One of those included the idolatry question. We had talked about at the end of last week about how they came from pagan backgrounds. This was an idolatry culture, and they're still struggling with the difference between idolatry and Christian freedom. And we talked about how, in the United Methodist tradition, we drink grape juice as part of communion rather than wine so that we would not suffer our brothers and sisters who struggle with alcoholism to stumble. And so Paul reiterates this idea that we have a responsibility for how our actions affect others, and that the things that we do should not be out of some sort of logistic or legalistic perspective, but out of how we love one another. And so if the question again came up about eating meat that was sacrificed to idols, legalistically, no, there's not a problem with that. But from a loving perspective, perhaps we need to avoid that for those who might be confused and find that as an acceptable means of continuing to participate in idolatry. And in chapter 11, we start to see some issues coming up around worship, particularly head coverings and the Lord's Supper. And so this is particularly the head coverings. And you've probably seen that there are still today some Christian traditions where women in particular wear veils or some sort of head covering all the time. This belief comes out of 1 Corinthians 11. And it's interesting, this was actually a question that came up during my studies in seminary. And really it goes back again to the cultural traditions of the time. Now, a lot of these churches were made up not just of free people, but also of slaves. And the tradition of that culture was that married women wore scarves or veils over their heads to show that they were married, whereas a slave woman would not have that kind of protection or that kind of honor, if you will. And so Paul's comment about wearing veils by women was actually a means of allowing the women who were slaves to be given some honor and some equality within the congregation, and not meant as a legalistic way of saying, no, you don't deserve to be treated equally. So it's interesting how these cultural perspectives can make a difference in how we translate and understand the lessons that are being taught. Again, you can go to someplace like mystudybible.com and find information about the cultural aspects of first century Roman Empire. And if always you have a question you don't understand, why do we do this and whereas others don't, and so on and so forth, feel free to always reach out to your pastor, to me. I would love to explore those ideas with you and discover them together.